Dave Garrow, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel. And you and I have had a number of discussions as you were in the process of writing your book on Barack Obama. And of course, a lot of people here in Springfield who work in and around the Illinois Capitol remember him when he was a state senator and had many discussions. And that was, I understand, part of your research, talking and reaching out to those people who knew Barack Obama when he worked here in the state capitol as a state senator. So.
Yes, from 2009 through 2013, I spent weeks and weeks down here, often during the veto session, and spoke with really scores of people here in Springfield who knew Barack and worked with him in the Capitol. It was a great experience. You well remember how I came to you asking, to be able to see some of the old interview footage of, when you were, interviewing Barack, over in the rotunda, of the Capitol back in the late 1990s on various occasions. The 8 years that he spent here, in Springfield, in the legislature, was a very formative time for him. He arrived here in 1997 thinking that he was going to be entering some public policy debating society where, the great issues of public policy would be, discussed and argued about. And instead, he found he was in Pate Phillips' world because the Illinois State Senate at that time was Republican-controlled. Controlled by very conservative Republicans. But Barack did a great job here, unheralded, working with conservative Republicans like Dave Severson on the Public Health and Welfare Committee, working with Republicans like Kirk Dillard and Ed Petka on the Judiciary Committee.
I know one of the things Barack, as I recall back then, was starting the tracking of when you get pulled over, what was the race.
Yes.
Well, I mean, and he wanted to say that way. All of a sudden, the police officers knew they had to record the race, and were they pulling over an undue amount of black men, and that. But that was one of the things I recall when Barack was a state senator.
Yeah, he was very successful at creating a consensus in support of that driving while black legislation, because initially the various law enforcement groups were very opposed to doing anything. And Barack made a major effort, successful effort, at convincing everyone that this was good for everyone, not just black drivers, but for honest law enforcement officers too.
And the name of your book?
Rising Star, The Making of Barack Obama. The paperback is just coming out here the end of May, early part of June 2018.
Why did you select Barack Obama as a subject, and how it must be an enormous amount of work, and you basically live with this individual in your research for
8 or 9
years.
Yes. No, all told, I spoke myself directly with over 1,000 people for this book. Lots of them from here in Springfield, lots from his time at Harvard Law School in the late 1980s. Scores of his former students at the University of Chicago Law School. He spent, really 10 years as a law teacher there in Hyde Park. I first got interested in early 2008 when Barack first won the Iowa caucuses at the beginning of the Democratic primary process, because I was embarrassed that I knew almost nothing about him, although I'd written this big biography of Martin Luther King Jr., Bearing the Cross, and much of my writing over the years has had an African American focus. So I began reading everything there was about Barack over the course of calendar 2008. And then 2 months after his inauguration, I made the decision to go to Chicago and start speaking with the community organizing mentors who'd been the central people in Barack's life 1985 to 1988. When he's in Chicago, before law school.
If I might, just because time's going to be short,
Sure.
I would love to do an hour long with you, and we could get into, because I love this kind of stuff. In the course of writing the book, and just to skip the stone across, rock across the pond, so to speak, what would you say are his attributes, and what would you say in your discovery that you would say or some of the negatives about either how he governed, his personality, or how you want to define it?
The Barack Obama who served here in Springfield is a very winsome, very attractive public figure. And he succeeded in reaching across the aisle just beautifully. As president, he was less successful and I think less devoted, less energized to that reaching across the aisle. The Republicans whom he failed to bond with in Washington were no more conservative than the Republican colleagues here in Springfield.
Right.
And I think Barack tried harder here in Springfield than he did as president.
And, you know, I spoke with Alan Dixon, former senator from Illinois, and he was critical of passing Obamacare. He said you don't pass legislation of that magnitude without getting bipartisan support. He said if you don't get Republican votes on something like that, you didn't compromise enough.
Right.
And that I would say, and maybe I'm totally off base, but I haven't done all your research, that in a way one of the bad things that happened to Barack Obama when he became president is that he had such a supermajority in the Congress and there was no breaking on him when he came into the White House with much less experience at the federal level than almost any other president.
And I think...
Would you agree with that?
Yes. And I think Barack was harmed, too, in the White House by having around him people who repeatedly would tell him how great he was, how brilliant he was, rather than who would challenge him. And I think any president benefits from having close colleagues who are willing to disagree rather than just being congratulatory. And I don't think that Barack made the effort to retain people who would disagree with him. So you end up with an inner circle of people who are always telling you how great you are. Valerie Jarrett is the classic example of this. That doesn't serve you well as chief executive.
I've talked to other governors here of Illinois, and they said you need someone that tells you you're full of it.
No, I thanks to my time here and people I know a decent amount about Jim Edgar's time as governor in the 1990s.
He was one of the people that
right.
had people on his staff that would tell him you're full.
Exactly, and I can think of several people, and a chief executive benefits from that as Governor Edgar did, and Barack as president didn't have as much of that as there should have been.
We're going to, I think, air this before your speech here as a preface, so we won't go much longer, but let me ask you, did you actually talk to Barack Obama himself, and did you find anything out about some of these quandaries? Let me just throw out very briefly, because it probably won't come out in this question. So the Kenya birth thing and/or what about the records from college and those not being released?
Right. I spent a total of 8 hours with Barack in the White House on 3 different occasions in 2016. He read about 90% of this book in manuscript, marked it up, and we sat there on 2 of my visits, 2 different Sunday afternoons, and went through what Barack had underlined, what he wanted to argue about. I think that Barack was someone who was very much transformed by his time in Chicago in the 1980s. The thing I'd emphasize really more than anything is, he is born in Hawaii. His prep school education there at the Punahou School is a very formative experience. But everyone who knew him up through age 24 thought he was a nice guy but unremarkable. Then after the 3 years in Chicago, when he arrives at Harvard Law School in 1988, everyone who meets him then, fellow students, professors, basically thinks, voila, this is a remarkable young man whom we'll all be reading about.
And one of the we have Senator Durbin telling the story of the Union League Club where he pulls Barack aside. Ironically, they go into the president's room, which is right off the main lobby, and Senator Durbin says, you ought to run for president.
Right.
Barack goes, you know, I haven't been here that long. We know the rest of history. He ran. However, if Barack Obama had not run in 2008, in your mind, was he intending to run for president at some point, but maybe he just needed to be pushed at that point?
I think the record's quite clear that Barack was so underwhelmed by the U.S. Senate, which he joined in early 2005. His disappointment at life as a U.S. senator is a major influence in leading him to decide to run in 2007, 2008. Indeed, I think it's fair to say that he found the U.S. Senate disappointing compared to the Illinois State Senate.
And I'll just close out just to say, since I've covered both bodies, it always shocked me. In Congress, these people have like 25 staffers.
Right.
You come to Illinois, they have one part-time secretary, and they take more votes. So it's amazing how much more work the Illinois legislature does than the U.S. Congress.
Yes, yes. Now, Barack had a very successful time here as a state legislator.
Ultimately, last question, did the president like the book or when you met with him?
There's much of it he does like. There are a number of things that he's not happy about, particularly his girlfriends back in the 1980s, whom he was close with before Michelle. Barack is a very private person and believes very strongly in an absolute compartmentalization between public life and private life. And the fact that my book says so much about his private life before Michelle is something that he, unsurprisingly, doesn't like.